tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. It's a few days after the full moon, the February full moon. This full moon is the Buddhist holiday in the Theravada world known as Māgha Pūjā, and this is Sangha Day. The brief story, I told it a bit more in full at Sangha Live this past Sunday, so you can find that recording on their channels. There's three big Buddhist holidays, in a very efficient sort of way, one for the Buddha, one for the Dhamma, one for the Sangha, each of the triple gem. The day for the Buddha is Vesak in May, or Visakha Pūjā in Pali. That celebrates the person of the Buddha, so the birth, awakening, and death of the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama of the Sakya clan, the sage of the Sakyas, Shakyamuni. Dhamma Day is celebrated on the full moon of July. So a few months after the Buddha's awakening, when he went to meet his friends in the deer park outside of Sarnath and taught the first public discourse known as Setting in Motion the Wheel of the Dhammacakka Pavattana Sutta, laying out the middle path between mortification and indulgence, and the training of the Eightfold Path and the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, leading to the opening of the Dhamma eye of his first disciple to awaken, Anya Kondanya. Anya Kondanya means Kondanya who knows. The Buddha gives the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, says this is dukkha, this is why there's dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction. There's dukkha. And he says, but there's a reason for dukkha, which is craving. There's an end to dukkha because it's possible to end craving, but you have to work at it, and that's the path. And while he's giving that teaching, Kondanya has the dustless, stainless realization of the Dhamma, and his eye opens, and he exclaims, all things that bear the conditioning to arise have the conditioning to pass away. Everything that arises passes away. That's the insight that arises following the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha did not teach impermanence. The Buddha taught suffering and its cause and the possibility of its end. And Kondanya put the pieces together, and he realized impermanence. And that was the opening of the Dhamma eye. All things that have the nature to arise have the nature to cease. And so the celebration of that moment, the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma, the text says, that cannot be stopped by Buddha, Mara, Brahma, human or God, or any being in the world. The wheel of the Dhamma cannot be stopped. Happened at Sarnath in the deer park. So that's called Asala Pūjā, the full moon in July. And it's also the day before the beginning of the rains retreat. So then there's the rains. At the end of the rains, there's a little holiday called Pavarana, where you celebrate the successful completion of the rains. And then you have a big gifting ceremony known as the Katina. And then in January or February, depending on how the lunar cycle lands, you have the third of the yearly holidays, which is Māgha Pūjā. So the Buddha, did his thing, and 6 months later, there were a whole bunch of enlightened beings, because he taught the first 5 monks, and then he taught the kind of rich playboy Yasa and his 50 friends. They all became arahants, and then he converted 500 fire worshippers who were students of the Kassapa brothers. He partly did it by doing enormous fire miracles, because he had to impress them before they would listen to him. But he converted the Kassapa brothers and their fire worshipping ascetics, and then a few other bands of ascetics, so that within the first year of his ministry, there were 1,250 fully enlightened arahants in the world. And in January of that year, it's possibly the first year following his awakening. It might be the the year following that. The scholars aren't exactly sure where it dates in the canon, but the first 1,250 arahants who have already been sent out by the Buddha to preach the Dhamma in distant lands, they all have the intuition that they want to go back and see their teacher on the exact same day, and they all come back walking, long way, and they all gather on the full moon in February. And if you've been to India, South Asia in what we call the winter, it's glorious. January, February is like the peak of spring. Everything is blossoming. It's beautiful. The rains are over. Springtime has sprung. It's glorious. So this is also a kind of big springish festival, as it were. And so these 1,250 arahants all show up where the Buddha is staying. And the Buddha teaches them a brief summary of the Dhamma and a brief summary of the monastic code that has become a famous verse. There's 3 verses of it. It's in the Dhammapada. It's called the Ovādapatimokkha. And the middle verse is the one considered the full summary of the teachings. The translation is, don't do any evil, do what's good, purify the mind. This is the teaching of the Buddhas. So that's it, people. That's the whole sandwich. Don't do any evil. And my footnote on this is always, every once in a while I look around for a different translation of the Pali word papa than evil, and I just come back to evil. I don't mind it. I'll give you my definition of evil in a minute. But don't do any evil, do what's good. So good here also means kusala. Kusala, skillful, beautiful, do the beautiful. Purify the mind. So don't neglect concentration, don't neglect immersion. And this is the teaching of the Buddhas. The line actually says this is the Buddha sasana. And sasana both means kind of the teaching. Sometimes it's translated as dispensation, but it also means the era of the Buddhas. Like this is what is true. This is what has been brought into the world by the Buddhas, and it lasts as long as the Dhamma lasts in the world. The Dhamma is not permanent. The core principles of the Dhamma are timeless. Nibbana is timeless. But the actual teachings are impermanent, of course, because they're conditioned, right? Conditioned to arise, conditioned to pass away. The Dhamma begins to pass away from the world when people no longer respect concentration, the Pali Canon tells us. Loss of respect for the cultivation of the mind is the beginning of the loss of the Dhamma. And what eventually the only thing is left is empty rituals, texts that don't actually bear fruit, teachings that don't bear fruit, because the cultivation of the mind has been lost, of the heart has been lost. So every generation has the responsibility to preserve not only the Dhamma, but the practices for the next generation. And any of you who have studied deep meditation, that have studied the jhanas or have studied the extraordinary states, you know that they're not easy, and also that the instructions leading to them are easy to get wrong. It's easy to not really get there, right? They're not obvious. And when the Buddha discovered them or rediscovered them, he knew that they weren't obvious. That was partly why he almost didn't teach until after his awakening, when it occurred to him that what he had realized was so subtle that people would not get it, and that would be frustrating for him. The deity Brahma Sahampati came down from the heaven realm, it says, take that as you will, as quickly as a strong man might flex his extended arm or extend his flexed arm, appearing in front of the Buddha, and said, "Blessed one, you are wrong," bowed to him, honored him, kept him on his right. As it said, "Blessed one, you're wrong. There are beings in the world with little dust in their eyes, perishing for not hearing the true Dhamma. Teach, and they will understand what you are teaching." And then the Buddha looked around with his divine eye and saw that it was true, agreed to teach, and Brahma Sahampati said to himself, "My work here is done." He bowed to the Buddha and disappeared and went back to the Brahma realms. And I'm mentioning some of the supernatural stories partly because I love them, and because I think it's important to not just hold the Dhamma as like a nice pre-modern psychology, but that actually to do so, to take what the Buddha did or understood purely as a kind of, like a nice positive psychology from the ancient times, misses, I think, the deep radical punch of the Buddha's teachings. That actually the Buddha is not just saying, here's how to be happy, be mindful, be kind, be compassionate, and things will be a little bit better. No shade on Dan Harris at all, but right, the Buddha was not going for 10% happier, he was going for 100%. And the 100% goes way beyond a kind of psychological fix, and it goes way beyond a kind of communal, social improvement. There's no social improvement that leads to liberation, because conditions that have the nature to arise have the nature to pass away. And so it's important to serve well-being in the world, because people can't practice when they're starving or being attacked, or in dire circumstances. But neither psychological healing, psycho-emotional healing, nor social, political healing is enough to uproot craving. There has to be this piece that goes beyond that. So, so here's that verse again, the summary of the Dhamma. Don't do any evil, do what's good or beautiful, purify the mind. That is the teaching of the Buddhas. So that's the teaching of Māgha Pūjā, the Ovādapatimokkha. It goes like this in Pali. Sabha papasa karanam kusala supa sampada sachitta pariyodapanam etang buddhana sasanam. So, don't do any evil. Sabha papasa akaranam. So sabha, all, papasa, evil, akaranam, don't do it, right? Kara, action, karma. Akaranam, don't do it, right? Don't do all evil. Sabha papasa akaranam kusala supa sampada. Sampada is the path or the practice. Take the path of the beautiful. Go on walk the path of the wholesome. Do what's good. Do what's good. Also do what's skillful, right? Kusala is skill. It's not just do good, but it's do it in a skillful way. Do it in a way that works, right? That's important, right? So it takes practice. It actually takes skill to do good. Kusala supa sampada, do what's good. Sachitta pariyodapanam. Sachitta, the heart-mind. The chitta is the mind, the heart, the inner faculty that can be trained. So train the chitta. Sachitta pariyodapanam, cultivate, train the mind. And the training in the mind, of course, is all three of the limbs of the samadhi basket of the Eightfold Path. So that is wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise immersion or concentration, samadhi. Wise effort is to make an effort to cultivate wholesome states and diminish unwholesome states. Wise mindfulness is to cultivate the four foundations, mindfulness of the body, of the emotional body, of the states of the mind, and of the qualities of the path. And then samadhi, to cultivate the four jhanas, the states of profound immersion that are stable, blissful, steady, nourishing. So cultivate the mind. Etang buddhana sasanam. Etam buddhana sasanam. This is the sasana of the Buddhas, the dispensation or the era of the Buddhas. This is the work of the Buddhas, the training of the Buddhas. So that's Māgha Pūjā, the gathering of the great gathering of the Sangha. I've been, in various ways, as some of you have been here, I've noticed, and in other places, I've been speaking more about the particular conflagration in our world right now, that known as the war in Gaza. And I want to speak to it a little more tonight in the context of this vast teaching that is completely central to everything the Buddha offered, which is the teaching on Kamma, on action. And you heard this in one of the reasons I wanted to do this series of chants that leads into how the Buddha talked about the aggregates in relation to the characteristics. This is more of a, if you're brand new here, this is the technical part of the talk. No worries if this is not your jam, but here it goes. The aggregates of form, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness are all unsatisfying dukkha. They are all impermanent. They are all not self. And what this points to is that the story we have about who we are and what things mean can never be the whole story, and it doesn't define us, and it doesn't define the world. Stories and narratives about how things are change all the time. Because those stories, which is to say everything that we could call meaning, what things mean, changes all the time. Because meaning is a human creation. The meanings that we spin in our stories and songs and dramas are human creations. Other types of being, they create their own meaning. There is undoubtedly, a dolphin metaphysics, and a dragonfly mysticism, where they understand the world and they maybe have a song they sing to their kids, and stories they tell about how the world is. That's meaning for them, right? For us, we tell certain kinds of stories, and of course, depending on where you are and what kind of body you wear and what kind of stories your family told you, you tell certain kinds of stories. And I grew up hearing white Catholic American stories. My ancestral people told English and Spanish and Puerto Rican and West African and Caribbean stories. The people whose land I'm living on right now told Southern Pomo stories. All of those different bodies of knowledge move energy in the world in different ways. I was adopted into a family that at one point told Jewish stories, then they converted to telling more Catholic stories. And I'm talking about heritage here as stories because I think it's really important to remember that, particularly if we take long Kamma to mind or to heart, the body that we wear does not define who we are. If rebirth is real, and rebirth can be, a metaphor if you want, but it's a way of talking about long time, really long time. When the Buddha opened his own Dharma eye, he did it by seeing past births. And he didn't see 10 or 100 or 1,000, which would keep you within the scope of human history. It wasn't like, oh yeah, the Buddha could have gone like bloodline ancestral and been like, I'm of the Sakyan people. And the Sakyan people are the Aryan people who, if we believe the story of modern scholars, and let's just put that in a sort of bubble of possible narrative, maybe he would have said, oh, my people, the Sakyans, we came to this land south of the Great Mountains 1,000 years ago, maybe 2. We were the people that created the Vedas. But before that, we were actually horse-riding people of the Central Asian steppe, whatever names he would have used for that. There's a possibility that the Buddha's clan actually, far from being Vedic, was actually carrying the remnants of a kind of early Persian Zoroastrian faith, which is why the wheel symbol, which is a solar symbol, is virtually identical to the wheel symbol of the Persians. on the great temples north of the Himalayas. And the idea that those people rode their great horses down around the Himalayas into the valley of the Indus and then down into the great valley of the Ganga and encountered the people that were there, indigenous to that land, brought culture and language and ritual practice. And, you know, when I was in India with my partner almost 20 years ago now, we were in Orissa and we were visiting some temples, as one is wont to do on a trip like that. And there was a big protest happening. And we looked into what the protest was, and it was an indigenous protest against Indian people for stealing their land. And we were like, somebody tell us what the story is here. And they were like, oh, these are the tribes of indigenous folks. They're outcast because they're not part of the Hindu caste system, but actually they are protesting because their land was stolen by colonial Indians. And we were like, when was the land theirs? Like, when was it stolen? And they were like, oh, about 7,000 years ago. And we're like, oh, where I'm from, the people are protesting that their land was stolen 200 years ago. These people are protesting land stolen millennia ago. And they're saying, we're still here. We belong to this place. And so it's possible, who knows, but this is one idea, that the Buddhist people actually were the colonial people that came in and settled and brought all sorts of things, including a wheel that spins in the sky. A wheel that spins in the sky and sends sparks of fire out in all directions and is the sign of royalty. And you know how kings conquer land mythically in India? One story in the Buddhist texts about how this works is that a great noble king who conquers without violence expands his realm, and I'll leave that in the gendered masculine because these are patriarchal texts, expands his realm by setting in motion, he doesn't really set in motion himself, but the wheel symbol of royalty comes off of its perch at the royal palace, and it begins to roll by its own energy across the land. The wheel is rolling by itself. The king's army follows the wheel. And there's a parallel version in Hinduism where they release a horse. This is called the horse sacrifice. It's an enormously expensive ancient sacrifice. They release a horse to wander the countryside, and the army follows it, and wherever the horse goes becomes the land of that king. So the wheel-turning king releases the Dharma wheel, and it rolls, and the army follows, and the people accept the new emperor, essentially, because he's conquering without violence and bloodshed and lives ethically and cares for people in a non-warring way. That's an ancient myth of the wheel-turning king that has some mythic threads that may reach back beyond the settling of South Asia by the people from further north that may have become the Buddhist people. So Kamma is the teaching that the Buddha uses to talk about history. And it's what he sees in his first vision of his past lives, because what he sees is not just that he now, the person of the Buddha, has been born many, many, many times. This is not a Hindu conception of the soul, which is immortal, putting on and taking off bodies like articles of clothing. That's the teaching in the Bhagavad Gita. It's not that teaching. It's different from that. This is the idea that there's a momentum that rolls through history. And that momentum is kept in motion by action. And it's particularly kept in motion by the effects of actions. And so actions have effects because we're not alone here, right? Because there's other beings. So actions have relational effects. That's really what Kamma is action that causes something to happen for someone else. You know, and you're part of that someone else, so it's not just directional. But, you know, the precepts are all relational, right? killing beings, right? Other beings. Yourself as one of the possible beings you might kill, but other beings, animal, spirit, human. Taking other people's stuff, the second precept. Sexual misconduct, right, with other people, the third precept. Lying to other people. Misusing intoxicants such that your actions become harmful to other people. So the precepts are relational. They stitch us together. And they do this, they're so important because it is our actions that cause the future, that create the future, right? Our actions create the conditions for the future. How the Buddhists went about trying to work out the details of Kamma starts to get complicated, but if we keep it simple, the teaching really is that action always bears fruit, and it bears fruit either soon or later into the future, but it always bears fruit. And it bears fruit in a way that is resonant with its ethical valence. So if you cause bad harm will happen later, like bad results will come of it. They come in one's own life, like if I really hurt someone, that hurts me for a long time. It also hurts them and their people for a long time. Both of those conditions are true. But the Buddha really focused on the impact of actions for oneself. Because if you are hurting beings, if you're going around the world causing harm, it's very, very difficult to purify the mind. You just can't. It's very hard to recover from such remorse and grief and bring the mind to healing. And so the teaching of Kamma and rebirth is that you will experience the results of your own actions, whether sooner or later. And one explanation for rebirth is that, it doesn't look like everyone always experiences the appropriate results of their actions in this life. Sometimes dreadful people become rich and successful. There's a few of those floating around out there, right? So when will they get their just desserts? When will the enormous amount of criminal conduct they've done catch up with them and they finally go to jail and not win elections or something, not naming any names? So when will that happen? What if it doesn't? And the understanding is it will eventually. And so this is both a theory about how individual liberation works, but it's also a theory of history. And I think this, in a way that's not talked about perhaps as much as I would prefer, this is one of the uniquely Buddhist understandings of how history works that I think can be really helpful when we try to wrap our hearts around a calamity like what's happening in the Middle East right now. The teaching that everything bears fruit can be felt in a few different ways. One is that when horrific actions are taken, when terrible harm is done, that harm continues to bear fruit, to ripple forward in time for a very long time. For a very long time, If any of you all are conversant in, Islamic history, you might, or even, the simple bases of present-day Islamic politics, you might know that there are two main branches of Islam, the Sunni and Shia branches. Do you know why Islam split into two branches? Because the very, very early in the growth of the tradition, Julie's right, the lineage was split. There was a disagreement about who should become the next prophet, and it was one of Muhammad's cousins, and some people thought it should be this person, and some people thought it should be this person. It wasn't completely clear, and boom. That was about 1,200 years ago. And there's essentially an Islamic civil war still unfolding in the world based on that original schism. And so it's a bit facile to say, I understand the, I understand the intensity or the almost incomprehensible intensity of the Israeli violence happening in Gaza right now, because I have some felt sense that of the unspeakable violence of the Holocaust, right? That's an argument that's sometimes brought forward, right? How could this people not try to defend itself given how much harm was done to them? And I think that's actually a reasonable basis for compassion, but it doesn't go far enough. And the reason it doesn't go far enough is that Kamma never comes down to a simplistic one-to-one cause and effect relationship. There's so much more here, right? The relationship between these two peoples, and it's really more than those peoples because this has spilled out now, not only to all the other countries in the region, but here in the United States, like our peoples here, somehow this evangelical Protestant country on the other side of the world has decided that it is the strongest supporter of this Jewish state on the other side of the world. That's Kamma. How did that happen, right? Part of what is extraordinary about studying history, and everyone should do it a lot, is that the more stories essentially you digest and try to integrate about how we got here, the more threads interweave. The more threads come together that connect. There's the thread that connects to how the British tried to salvage the crumbling of the colonial world by drawing borders in the Middle East. There's a thread of how wealthy Jewish families following the Holocaust tried to not only create a Jewish homeland, but channel wealth in certain ways that would protect it. There's ways, you can pull on, that metaphor of the tapestry where you pull on any thread and the whole thing vibrates. Pull on any thread in this thing and you get, or you pull on the thread, right? And you get the whole tapestry. And so, dig into the horror of Hamas's initial attack, which was not an initial attack, of course, because this is not a war that began on October 7th. This is a conflict that is difficult to find a beginning date for, because it didn't begin with the Second Intifada, and it didn't begin with the first one, and it didn't begin at the Six-Day War, and it didn't begin in 1968, and it didn't begin in 1948, and it didn't begin with the arising of Zionism in the late 19th century before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and it didn't begin in the Crusades, and it didn't begin when the Jews took in Muslims in the 10th century in a compassionate way. And it didn't begin with Muhammad. This Kamma keeps going until it stops. The wheel keeps turning until it stops. And if we remember that very first teaching that the Buddha gives, and he says there is that which is unsatisfying, painful, not getting what you want, not stabilizing security, not feeling safe, not being able to relax in the world. That is the case because of craving, because we cannot land with ourselves and each other in a way that is wholesome. There's this force in the heart that grips, and it continues to grip. And so it says, because you hurt my father, I will hurt you. And because you hurt my people, I will hurt you. And I can't stop. And so what we learn as we feel into the history is that because action that causes harm continues to bear fruit, one of those fruits is resentment and revenge and fear and hatred, and that continues to roll. And that wheel, which is a wheel of suffering, it rolls and it rolls. This is partly why I think the Buddha said that what he found was so subtle, it was difficult to teach. And I think it's because stopping that wheel is really difficult. Don't get confused here. I'm talking about two wheels. There's the wheel of suffering. That's samsara. It rolls. There's the dharma wheel that can't be stopped. The way these wheels interact is that the Dhamma in the world offers a path to liberation. It offers, and liberation here, big word. What it means is stop the wheel of samsara. It means this ancient karma that haunts my heart and haunts the world. It stops in my generation. It stops here. But the thing about this is, of course, that you can't stop it for anyone else. This is heartbreaking. And the Buddha knew it. He was like, people aren't going to listen. This is going to be frustrating. I'm going to say stop craving, and people are going to be like, no. You know? He almost doesn't teach because it's so hard to do. But you can do it for yourself, and you can do it in your own heart if you do these three things. First, you stop hurting others as best you can, right? You don't do evil. My definition of evil is harmful action that you know is harmful and you still do it. So it's intentional harm caused. It's not mistakes, and it's not even like, reflexive self-protection based in trauma, right? There's some way that I'm not going to say like, oh, the Israeli military action is evil, categorically. What I'll say is evil is folks who know that what they're doing is horror and are still doing it, who somehow are conscious of being one who causes terrible harm in this way. And this is not a Christian use of evil. Those people aren't evil. Intentional harmful action is evil. That's what it means as a training. And so the training is renunciation. Stop doing that. But to do that, you have to get a wedge in on the instinctual, striking that wheel. You know that old game where Victorian field game where you have a hoop and you strike it with a stick. You keep the hoop rolling. Don't hit the wheel with your stick, right? Renunciation is required to let it actually end, and it has to end in this heart, because you can't make it end for anyone else. You can't convince anyone else to stop craving. I'm doing my damn best, I tell you, but because that's my job as a teacher, right? And I know that many of you are as well, acting in the world. Activism is mostly preaching, I think, right? You're trying to say, I'm trying to stop craving and causing harm, and I want to encourage you to stop craving and causing harm. And it's heartbreaking because mostly the people that we really need to convince are not really listening. There's a lot of dust in folks' eyes. It's hard to preach to people who don't want your message. But it's the only way, is to stop the craving in your own heart, stop the wheel in your own heart, and then it gets to stop in the hearts of those that you meet with kindness. So I am cheered on by all of the activists for peace, all of the peacemakers, all the people who gather across battle lines to make human connection, to try to figure out how to not just live in peace, not just create two states, not just come to ceasefire and return hostages, but yeah, please do all those things, but actually figure out how to. This is why the Buddha almost didn't teach, and why he says his bowl floated upstream, because it goes against the current of the world. That what's required is not actually just finding a reasonable compromise so that enemies can live near each other for a little while longer without killing each other, but is actually to figure out how to stop a war that has been going on for millennia. to stop a cycle of retribution and and pain that's been going on for millennia. And the Buddha says that when he remembers his past lives, he remembers not just the millennia of human history, but cosmic eons expanding and contracting. So history goes back way further than we even can trace. And the idea is that craving has followed us that entire time. Right? Through all of the worlds, through all of the kinds of birth, through animal and human and divine being births, and through hell realms and heaven realms, this craving haunts us like an ancient trauma. And but it's possible to be free if you understand that everything that has the conditions to arise also has the conditions to cease. And that doesn't just mean the good things will be lost because impermanence. It also means that trauma can end, and that ancient traumas can end because they had the conditions to arise, and therefore the conditions can be cultivated for them to cease. So this is a prayer that the ancient conditions of trauma for the peoples of Palestine and Israel and the Middle East, but really for all of us, that we find the end of this, and that our practice is a support for finding the end. All right, so we'll pause there. Thank you for your kind and generous attention. And we have some time for questions and discussion. As always, we're approaching our formal end time, but I don't even know what that means. I just invented that. So what I usually invent is that I will stick around for a little bit for any kind of discussion that wants to be here. Welcome to new folks, and thank you to everyone for your support of this Sangha and what you offer in dana and the generosity of your resources and time. It's a pleasure to be together. So, some space for reactions, reflections, complaints, dukkha, celebration. Ron.
Sean?
Ron, please.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, I feel like every time I'm with you, it's a master class, and so I really appreciate it. It is. Thank you. I'll steal a line from Ram Dass, who said that he was Jewish on his parents' side, and I'm the same.
Indeed.
And I understand very much from the Buddhist perspective and the human perspective of what you're explaining, and I very much appreciate the love of that. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, good friend, the other night, who is Jewish, and I was telling him, I think I had heard you talk last week. I think you dealt with this a little bit, and I was relating some of what you passed on then, and just to cut to the chase, he said, yes, but they want to drive the Jews into the sea. And, it's like, yeah, from a historical perspective, I completely understand what your explanation. And I think it's difficult for a person living now in the 21st century who maybe, if we didn't live during World War II, which I didn't, miss that by a little bit, and so did he. But we know what the Nazi feeling was about what they were trying to do to the Jews. And so I think it's difficult for a present-day Jew to, at least from my conversations that I've had, I don't feel this way. I understand the teaching, but I think it's difficult to try to explain that to somebody who is not Buddhist, who is a Jew.
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely.
It's like they want complete annihilation, not all Palestinians, of course, but the leadership of Hamas. And that's, it's difficult. The conversation gets into, well, why can't the Israelis just be surgical about it, and et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
So how do you explain that? How do you explain that to a person in that pain?
Well, with I don't know that I explain that person, or if I explain anything to that person other than expressing compassion.
Yeah.
You know, because there's virtually no satisfying realpolitik solution to this. Like, the Kamma has become so dense that there is not an easy solution. If there was an easy solution, it would be happening. You know, even if there was a difficult solution, it would be, you know, people would be trying really hard for it. And there are difficult solutions. But one reason actually is that the teaching that the uprooting of all ancient cravings, because I recognize that they keep me bound in suffering, that is a distinctly Buddhist interpretation of the world. And it dismisses tribe and caste and identity and species. The Buddhists are saying, you're not Jewish. You're not even really human. You happen to be Jewish and human in this moment, but the Kamma that created you is far vaster than that, and that is not a Jewish theology. And so I do not try to convince people who are not Buddhists of Buddhist theology. And so I'm not actually going to give a teaching on Kamma to a non-receptive audience, theologically speaking, because that's not respectful. I don't want to say that. I might say, you know, from my perspective as a convert Buddhist Gentile, I mostly focus on how ancient the threads of causation are for this, and how that points to how difficult a problem this is. And I don't have a solution for that. But I would start where you went, which is that it's not actually true that they want to drive the Jews into the sea. It's true that some people wish for the genocide of the Jews, and some people wish for the genocide of the Arabs and Muslim folks. But actually, relatively speaking, not that many people do. A few terrible people want entire other classes of people to die. That's horrid. That's evil. But most people don't want that. Most people don't want that. And the heart of every peace movement that I ever saw that was inspiring in Israel-Palestine consists of people talking to each other and becoming friends. All of those many things that we've seen of, you know, Jewish and Arab folks making contact, and you know, it has to start with respect. And it's difficult to invite someone into your home for dinner with respect when children are being killed, you know, and when the leadership on either side, you know, if the leadership of my country thinks that you should die and the leadership of your country thinks I should die, that is a very difficult way to make friends, but it can be done. And one important way that I think it must be done is to dissociate the people from their leadership. To actually say, this is the actions of a small group of constricted power, you know, ideological power. And actually most people don't want this. I think that's where I would start.
Thanks, Sean.
You know.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, I'm not trying to convince folks. I'm not trying to convince those folks. I want to convince the Buddhist faithful that there's a different way to think about this that might help in our own hearts and our actions in the world. You know, beyond that, it's you know, a little bit out of my territory. Yeah,
Thanks.
for sure. Blessings to your friend.
Sean, do you think
Please.
there's something on the understanding of this as like looking at the relative level versus the universal, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, like there's the relative level and the ultimate reality, ultimate level. Do you think it's useful to make that distinction in
Yeah,
this kind of situation?
sometimes. Mostly what I think about the two truths teaching, the relative and absolute truths that are present in all moments. This is a core early Mahayana teaching for those who are unfamiliar with it. The absolute level is the infinite non-dual perfection of things. Everything is already perfect, and then the relative is, of course, that everything feels imperfect and they're, self and other are real and all of that. So, both of those layers are true. The thing that I think that maybe is most useful about that teaching is that sometimes folks who get really stuck in relative identities, the Jews are like this, the Palestinians are like this, these are the aggressors, these are the victims, these are the aggressors, and these are the victims. That's the relative world. All of that is true, relatively speaking, right? Identity is real, heritage is real, trauma is real, oppression is real. But sometimes, if we have an orientation toward the absolute in any religious context, you can do this from within the context of saying that the God of Abraham is the God of all these people, and there is one God. Like you can do the absolute from that perspective if you want. If those are your religions, that can be, I think, a doorway into getting around the intensity of the relative difference, and say, like, we all pray to the same God. We actually all pray to the same God on the same mountain, virtually in the same temple, given that the mosque was built right on top of the ruins of the old temple, and they're right there on the same hill in Jerusalem. The absolute holds the whole thing in a kind of radiant, emptiness. But in the absolute, there's no meaning layer. There's no narrative. There's also no birth and death. So, there's a way that maybe it's not that useful. Like, you always have to come back to the relative and now figure out what to actually do. But I think it can be helpful as a way to remember not to get too stuck in any of the binaries that we get stuck in, or any of the constricted states that we get stuck in. As an external witness to this particular war, like, I'm neither Jewish nor Muslim, I'm neither Israeli nor Palestinian. I'm a Caribbean Buddhist convert Gentile on the other side of the world. Like, who cares what I think? In a certain way, for me, I would rather keep both feet grounded in the relative. In a certain way, the teaching on Kamma, it approaches the absolute because it gets so vast. You're like, well, everything is just, unfolding conditions. That's moving toward the absolute. But for myself, I feel most comfortable not going all the way into, like, radical infinite emptiness perfection, but actually staying with the tapestry of the, like, Kamma is complex, and peoples and histories and places are complex, because I think this is really the core gesture of the Bodhisattva rather than the Buddha. The Buddha fully dissolves into the infinite, paranibbana. The Bodhisattva says, I'm going to stay in the world where I can hear the relative. So I want to look at that land and not just do a thing that could be bypass, where I say, like, everything is just the will of God unfolding. That doesn't help me. I want to say, oh, these people were really hurt, and these people were really hurt, and these people have also been really hurt, and these people have caused harm, and these people have caused harm, and here's how they're family and related, and here's how they're at war, and here's how this ancient civil war, because of the schism in Islam, because that's what has given rise to, like, the Islamic civil war is right in the middle of this thing. The way that Iran supports these folks and the Saudis support these folks, and the Sunni-Shia conflict is everywhere in this thing, right? That's ancient karma. I don't want to forget that. So for me, the two truths are also not a binary, right? There's a big stretch between them. And my sweet spot, I'm just sort of making this up as I go along, but feeling into it from your question, my sweet spot is somewhere like solidly in the relative without forgetting the vast. And if I inch away from the fixated relative, I think for myself, I find a territory where the thing that feels most right to be present with is real human relationships, but in an infinitely interconnected kind of way. So it's not just dissolved into light, but it's also not fixated into, chess pieces, but that everything is woven together. So it's kind of that's where I like to sit on that spectrum, anyway. I think it can be medicinal, certainly in moments, to swing all the way into the vast. And then it's going to be necessary to figure out what to do tomorrow morning, at 9 a.m. to swing back into the relative and, answer your emails and send money to the right people and, whatever you do to try to end the war. Wars are ended only in the relative, not in the absolute. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good to have you, Eva. Anything else? I know it's a charged topic and it's potent. I tried to talk about this on Sunday at Sangha Live, and I'm more satisfied with what I did tonight than then. I've been sort of inching my way toward trying to figure out how to say this, I think. So thanks for hanging out for the practice, for the ongoing practice of that. Anything else before we close? All right, I want to close with one more little chant. Then I want to sing the verse proclaiming the truth of impermanence that Anya Kondanya exclaimed when he became liberated. This verse says, impermanent are all conditioned things. Their nature is to rise and fall. Having arisen, all things must end, and their stilling brings true happiness or bliss. So this is speaking to recognizing the conditioned nature of everything, how everything appears and disappears based in conditions, and that the stilling of this wheel, the settling of this cycle, is blissful, is profound in the heart. So this is the first verse on this page that I've pulled up. The words in Pali are anicca vata sankhara upadavaya dhammino upachittuva niruchanti tesang upasamo sukho. So I'm going to chant this 3 times so you can sing along, closing our practice together. Anicca vata sankhara upadavaya dhammino upachittuva niruchanti tesang upasamo sukho. Anicca vata sankhara upadavaya dhammino upachittuva niruchanti tesang upasamo sukho. Anicca vata sankhara upadavaya dhammino upachittuva niruchanti tesang upasamo sukho. May our practice be a condition for the ending of all war and suffering and oppression in the world. May our hearts cultivate the way, and may the wheel of the Dhamma roll on into the future for many generations. May our practice bear fruit, and may all beings be free. All right. So once again, thank you. Thanks for sticking out for a little long conversation about the world, and whatever this stirs up, may it inform your practice and your conversations. And may we, the species, our species, find a way through all of these wars to a true peaceful solution.